yet another episode of Academic Personality Series. Today, we have a guest that is very important to us, in person of Dr. Katheryn Nash. Dr. Katheryn Nash is a postdoctoral research fellow, and she is here to grace our program today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And now I'll give Dr. Katheryn an opportunity to introduce herself properly.
Great. Thank you again. So my name is Katheryn Nash. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Edinburgh Law School in the Political Settlements Research Program. And this program looks at peace agreements and peace processes. We've constructed a database of over 1,700 peace agreements that can be used by policymakers and academics for research purposes or as a resource. And we also do research on inclusion in peace processes, different provisions, implementation. So the program covers a wide range. Myself, I'm personally interested in sub-regional and regional organizations and how they might be engaged in peace processes. So, for instance, the Economic Community of West African States or the African Union, and how these organizations manage conflict in their areas, as well as how they engage with other actors to resolve conflicts.
Thank you, Katheryn. But I would like you to give us a little bit of context.
Okay.
Tell me about your background. How did you even start thinking about doing what you're doing, sub-region, conflict, and data set and all that? How did it all start?
Okay. So I originally was a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. And I worked for several years in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations and worked in a number of American embassies across Africa. And one of the things that developed for me was a curiosity to try and understand more about how different organizations or different institutions approach conflict management. What might be the differences? What are the similarities? How do we influence one another? And how do all these different actors in the international system work together? So it was really from my experience as a diplomat and in policy that got me interested in research.
I see. To me, it's sort of interesting because normally, under normal circumstances, you will see academics moving into being diplomats and being policymakers. Mm-hmm. But in your own case, it's a little bit opposite.
Yes.
What happened?
I think I just had a burning question that I wanted to answer. And I think initially I decided to do a PhD, and I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And felt that I would go get some expertise, develop my understanding further, do some field work, and then come back into policy and use what I had learned in the policy sphere. But as I got more into academia, I discovered that I liked teaching, I liked research, and that you can also work with policymakers in other ways. Okay.
Am I right to say that you are essentially a diplomat who is taking a sabbatical in the academia?
No. So I left diplomacy to do my PhD. I just thought I'd go back in. Mm-hmm. I thought that I would maybe rejoin the civil service, but actually I ended up staying in academia.
And you're happy with that?
I am. You seem surprised.
Yeah, well, it's obvious. Many people in the academia, at some point in their lives, they get bored and they want to do something different, and then they will tell you that I've been in the classroom for too long, I need to see the world, right? Mm-hmm. And you are from seeing the world into the four walls of the university, you see. It's very tricky to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now talk to me about the research you're doing, what it is, but I needed to put it in a layman's language so that our audience would be able to follow.
Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe to pick up on your last point just briefly on kind of going from the policy world into the classroom and connecting it to the research I currently do with the Political Settlements Program. One of the things I like about this program is that it tries to do very relevant research for policymakers, and it works with a lot of policymakers, it does policy briefs. So I feel like it's connecting academia and policy work in a way that is not just kind of in the classroom. And the research that we do, perhaps first I'll talk about the database. So the PACS Peace Agreement database, it has over 1,700 peace agreements from 1990 to 2018.
Wow,
And
that's a lot.
yes. I think what's unique about it is that we look at peace agreements as encompassing a broad range of documents, anything from pre-negotiations to declarations to ceasefires to large comprehensive agreements. And we make sure that all the agreements in the database are coded in a way where you can search for the inclusion of women or the inclusion of civil society or particular provisions that might deal with amnesty or that might deal with power sharing, which are all kind of important provisions that may be in any peace agreement that could help stop a conflict. And so we view it as a resource that you can use not only to study what happens in peace agreements and the trends and how they might best be constructed, but also a resource for people who are mediating or who are addressing conflicts, so that if they need an example provision or if they need to understand how peace agreements dealt with a particular issue like natural resources, they can go to this database and it's there, it's open source, and it's something that everyone can use, even though we've had to kind of do the work to create it and to maintain it.
Really, from the way you speak to me about this database and the number of peace agreements that you have, it looks to me like it's a very huge data set that would need analysis. Maybe I would like you to speak to our academic audience on how they can be able to key into that data set in case they have research related
question. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about my own research to also answer that. So academics have, and myself included, have used the data set to look at a number of issues. For instance, I am working on a policy brief that looks at how interstate agreements or agreements between states are perhaps used to deal with an intrastate or internal conflict. And so this is a particular type of agreement, and I'm trying to understand, why would two states sign an agreement to deal with an internal conflict in another state? When is this used? What is it useful for? And it might be that perhaps there's security implications for outside states. It might be that these two states have historical links to the conflict and want to try and solve it. And so it's taking a particular type of agreement and understanding where it has been used, so this can then be drawn upon for people who may use this agreement in the future. And there are other types of work that's ongoing in the program, for instance, to look at the inclusion of women in peace agreements, or perhaps their lack of inclusion, or how even if there's provisions and agreements that may not necessarily translate into substantial inclusion in the implementation. There is work ongoing to try and understand, I guess, the trajectory of agreements across time. Many conflicts are resolved by peace agreements, but oftentimes peace agreements can fail. So what happens then? Is it that there's a return to violence? Is it that there's a renegotiation? And this will be dependent on any given conflict, but with a data set this large, you can look at trends, and you can look to try and understand what's happening and then apply it to particular cases. If that makes sense.
Thank you about that. Now I would like to drive the point closer home. See, you're talking about peace agreements between states about a particular conflict. I would like you to speak to me about what's happening in Nigeria. Many pockets of conflicts. We are dealing with Boko Haram. We are dealing with herders farmers conflict. We are dealing with kidnappings. We are dealing with Niger Delta. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. How do you see your work can be able to help the Nigerian government to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future based on the landscape of conflict in the country currently?
Well, I would say the database might not have any predictive power in terms of conflict trends. Every individual context, whether it's Nigeria or any other country in the world, will have to look at what's happening. And I would say that the kind of principal investigator on the program and others working on the program would never want to take a cookie cutter approach and apply an analysis in one context to another. But I think what it can do is you can say, all right, we have an agreement that deals with natural resource issues, perhaps in the Niger Delta, or we have an agreement or we have a conflict that deals with access to land and water rights, or divisions across ethnicity or religion. Well, you can look and see what other peace agreements that have dealt with these issues have done, and use those as examples, not necessarily to just take into one context and put into another, but to give you ideas about potential ways that these issues could be addressed in peace agreements. And I think it can also provide some context about what to expect. These types of conflicts, the ones that you mentioned, Nigeria, are very difficult to resolve, and it might be that a comprehensive peace agreement isn't the best approach. It might be that an agreement that deals with one particular issue between two specific groups, as opposed to a large agreement, is going to be a better fit. So I think it just provides some context and some examples and some resources.
In most of the academic debates about conflicts, there's this debate about whether the major source of conflicts are resources, distribution of resources, or is it ideological based, right? And in the process of you getting involved with the research about peace agreements, what did you come across? What do you think is the major reason for most of the conflicts that are happening around the world? Is it ideology, or is it resources, distribution of resources?
Yeah, I think, again, that comes back to the issue of not wanting to take one context and put it into another. And what we've seen in peace agreements is that oftentimes it's overlapping issues that, people might say it's divisions along a particular line, but there's an underlying economic or identity issue. I don't think there needs to be one particular driver of conflict. I think it can be a multitude of factors that come together. And the factors that are perhaps most prominent are going to change from context to context. And so I personally would be against applying one particular theory universally in terms of what drives conflict.
What would you think of this statement that says in the history of mankind, this current time that we're living is the most peaceful of all times?
Are you drawing on Steven Pinker and the Better Angels of Our Nature?
What I'm talking about.
Yes. I read that book, and I did like it, and I think that as someone who studies institutions and who I think values those institutions as mechanisms to promote peace and to promote certain norms, even if they aren't always followed, even if there are, of course, still conflicts, I do think that we're kind of moving towards a more peaceful time, and that there's expectations now around what people can expect in terms of dignity and living a peaceful life and having resources and access to things like education and food and shelter. Does that mean that those expectations or those things are always met? Of course not. But I think it is notable that those things are now expected and that we have people advocating for them.
I mean, the reason I'm asking about this is because I want you to talk to me about what do you really think matters. The statistics about the number of people that are dying, the statistics about the people suffering starvation and all that, or a mother in Maiduguri, for example, seeing her child died because she cannot be able to feed that child, because the father died in the conflict and all
Mhm.
that. What really matters is it the statistics that we are dealing with in the establishments,
Mhm.
governments, and organizations,
Mhm.
or is it the real victim suffering from that conflict?
Mhm.
What are we supposed to be focusing on when we are comparing how peaceful our time is
Mhm.
in the past?
Mhm. So I would, again, you can tell I was a diplomat because I would say both matter. I think that you can look at trends and you can look at things to aim for in terms of improving the quality of life or ending conflict on a macro scale. And those are important perhaps for institutions who have to look at a bigger picture. But of course, the issue and the thing that people should all care about on a human level is the individuals impacted by conflicts and by starvation and by these things that cause human suffering. And so perhaps the way to continue to address those is to try and implement programs or to do research and to look at resolving them on a larger scale, but realize kind of why we do that is because the individuals who are suffering because of those things.
Yeah. I would like to ask you a question that I think is a little bit tricky, but I really want you to speak to me about this. The business behind conflict. What do you think it is? And is it real that conflict in the world today is a big business and there are some people behind it and we really are doing whatever they can to make sure that conflicts continue so that their business will continue to move?
That isn't my area of expertise. I would say that I agree that there are absolutely companies and organizations that profit off of conflict, whether through arms or illicit trades. And I certainly would say I think that's kind of undeniable. To the extent to which those companies are drivers of conflict or perpetuating them, I simply don't know. And I wouldn't, as a researcher, I wouldn't want to speculate.
Yeah.
But I take your
I
point that
understand. Yeah.
those are absolutely dynamics at play.
Let's talk about donor agencies a little bit and the help they are doing in terms of alleviating suffering from the victims of conflict. To what extent do you think their work have impact, positive impact on the victims of conflicts? The reason I'm asking about this because it's because of the debate about the perpetual dependency to the third world countries as a result of the handouts and all that. Which part of the continuum would you like to be on?
I mean, it's interesting. I think my PhD research was on kind of the Organization of African Unity and the African Union, and one of the politicians as well as academics that I studied was Nkrumah, who was very concerned about neo-colonialism and kind of economic dominance by the west of Africa. I think not only through exploitation and economic means, but he probably would also agree with the statement on kind of exploitation by or dependency perhaps on donor agencies. And so I think it's definitely something to be aware of. I think that there is perhaps has to be a distinguishment between humanitarian aid to address acute needs and developmental aid, and what's the appropriate balance there. I think anytime a donor agency goes into a country, it's of course working with the host government and there with the permission of the host government, and so there has to be a conversation between the government and that agency about what is necessary and what's appropriate. And I'll also come back to the issue of context. I think it would be difficult for me to say in a broad statement kind of what is the impact of donor agencies across the world, and it would have to be dependent on the context that you're working in and the relationship between the donor agency and the government. But again, kind of I understand the concern, and it's something that I'm cognizant of, but I don't necessarily think it would be good to, like, going back to the issue of, what are the drivers of conflict?
Mm-hmm.
In any particular instance, you're going to have more nuance to the issue than that.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. As we are drawing to the close of the program, would you like to speak to me about the future? What do you think the future holds for African countries, especially?
Mhm.
Because that is where the conflict is prevalent.
Mhm.
I want you to speak to me from the background of the population,
Mhm.
aging population mostly in the West,
Mhm.
and younger population in Africa.
Hmm.
But instead of staying in Africa, trying to migrate to the West.
Hmm.
What do you think is happening here? This dynamics, what do you think is happening, and what do you think will be, what kind of future will that create for both Africa and the developed world where the Africans are migrating to?
Again, kind of being the perpetual researcher, it's something that I haven't studied the dynamics of population flow, particularly across the seas and across regions, but I can speak a little bit to what I think might be in store in terms of conflict management in Africa, perhaps related to my research on sub-regional and regional organizations. And one of the things that I've noticed in my research, beginning with the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, is just the vast change in, one, the type of conflict management that the regional organization is willing to undertake, as well as the capacity and the institutions to do so. So now you have the African Peace and Security Architecture, you have things like the Conflict and Early Warning System, a developing standby force, a Peace and Security Council. You have organizations here in West Africa like ECOWAS, which in the past I think were often at the forefront of developing norms on conflict management and at implementing them. And there's some developing research coming out on the ways in which African institutions are actually leaders in international security in developing norms, and that there's a shift in terms of how sub-regional and regional organizations are working with international. So perhaps ECOWAS is at the forefront of being able to respond immediately to a conflict, and then has a complementarity with the UN or the African Union, who can come in at later stages if needed. And that, ECOWAS might be more forward-leaning in terms of addressing conflict, addressing unconstitutional changes of government. So I've seen a trajectory in terms of becoming stronger on conflict management, even if there's still, of course, capacity issues, still, of course, resource issues. And so in that sense, I'm hopeful that these regional institutions are going to be stronger in addressing conflict that happens in the continent, and hopefully mitigating conflict so that there aren't these kind of flows of people going outward, and that it's a more peaceful environment, because it seems to me you're talking about concern of conflict here and how that's impacting people's lives.
Yeah, especially on the movement of the population. Well, towards the end, I would like you to speak to me about something that is happening right now in Nigeria. The what they call cattle colony.
Okay.
Ruga program that the federal government is trying to start, which is as a result of the herders farmers conflict starting from North Central and down to the south and western part of the country. A few days ago, the federal government came up with a plan to do what they call Ruga settlement for the herders, and a lot of criticism, and all of a sudden we learned that the government stopped the program for a while. What do you think is happening here, really? Government is trying to solve a problem, but still met with criticism from the people, and stop the program. What do you think is going on here?
I really do not know. I'm not familiar with the program.
Okay.
But anytime that a government receives feedback from a population, or that there's issues having come from a diplomatic background or having been involved in policy, I think that's a very normal thing to receive feedback and to react. But I don't know the details, so I can't tell you what's going on. I'm sorry.
It's normal. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For gracing our program today.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and that's the end of our program.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.